Hello, everyone. Welcome to the morning show. We're coming to you this morning on Channel 9 and also on WJOP LP Newburyport FM 96.3. We're also live streaming on our YouTube channel at ncmhub.org. I'm your host, Mary Jacobsen, and I am just delighted this morning to welcome Jeffrey Urbin. He is an education specialist at the Roosevelt Presidential Library and Museum in Hyde Park, New York. And he's here this morning to talk about his favorite topic, Eleanor Roosevelt. I was fortunate enough to attend a virtual program that he recently offered through the Merrimack Library. And as you'll see this morning, he shows us Eleanor Roosevelt in a way that expands our understanding of her life story and deepens our appreciation of and admiration for her. So Jeff, first of all, thank you so much for taking time to come visit the morning show and share your favorite subject with us.
Oh, thank you so much for having me, Mary, and good morning, everybody.
Good. Yeah, thank you so much, Jeff. Well, Jeff, I'm curious to find out, what was it that initially drew you to want to understand Eleanor Roosevelt better?
Well, Mrs. Roosevelt was kind of contemporary to me. I was born before, she died before I was born, is what I'm trying to say. And but I remember my grandmother talking about her. My folks and grandparents were here from the Hudson Valley, and my grandmother would tell stories about how, she'd go to the market and she'd look up from the peach, pit, and then there would be, Mrs. Roosevelt. So
Wow.
she was really kind of alive, even though she had already passed. And then so the more I got to learn about her, she really was kind of an interesting person, because whereas President Roosevelt was kind of born here and then went, from there, Mrs. Roosevelt had a much longer journey that she had to go. She was sort of started down here and then had to work her way up much further. And the more you learn about her, the more you realize, what an exciting and in a way, I wouldn't say tragic, but in a way, sad life that she had, and yet she was able to overcome all of that.
Yeah, it's extraordinary. And that was one of the things that in your presentation made me really have a just much deeper appreciation for how, well, the title of your talk was How She Became Who She Was. So, but before we get into more of that, I'm just curious to find out from you, Jeff, what achievements or qualities do you think have made her through today such a subject of unending interest, fascination, really? Not just by historians, but by the general public as well.
Well, I think it's the fact that she's kind of, for lack of a better term, an everyman. She was born with all these advantages. She was a Roosevelt. She had wealth. She had connections. But none of that did her much good because of her own personal makeup. She was very shy. She was very insecure. She was very timid. And so I think what resonates with people is the fact that she never gave up.
Yeah.
She continued to grow her entire life. And she saw herself never as a finished product, but always as a work in progress. And because of that, I think people can sort of step into her shoes a bit and say, well, I'm not going to write the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. I'm not going to, be the first lady for 12 years. I'm not going to, be an Eleanor Roosevelt to the world, but maybe I can be an Eleanor Roosevelt to myself. Maybe I can be an Eleanor Roosevelt to the people around me. And if I continue to face the challenges that I have and just continue to move and continue to go and find a way, then that's really, I think, what draws people to her. I think both the president and Mrs. Roosevelt were what I like to call futurists. They were people who saw the future. Here's what we want this to be. We want to be at this place where things are the way we want them to be. We're not there yet, and they weren't Pollyannas. I mean, they were coming through the Great Depression, they were coming through the Second World War, but they saw where they wanted to be, they realized where they were, and then they built connections to get there, right? They worked to cross that middle zone, that middle line. And I think that's what was really appealing about both President and Mrs. Roosevelt, because they give you sort of permission and a roadmap and encouragement to build across that middle zone.
Well, that's fascinating. Extremely well put, Jeff, because what you're describing is both tenacity and a kind of a visionary optimism that are certainly, I think we all badly need those. I guess they're always badly needed, but we're alive today, and it feels today like we really need that kind of inspiration. So thank you for that.
Absolutely.
The theme. Oh, go ahead.
You can sit around and be you know and wallow in your troubles and wallow in your sorrows,
Yeah.
and sit there and get deeper and deeper, or you can get up and do something about it. And that's
Yeah.
really what the Roosevelts were all about.
Yeah. 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 And that's why, they continue to inspire people always.
Yeah,
So,
absolutely.
it's interesting to me, the theme of your talk that you gave at the Merrimack Library was betrayal in Eleanor Roosevelt's life. And I want to talk to you more about the impact that had on her character and her values. But let's start by describing some of the early chapters of that experience of betrayal in her life, because it went on through her whole life. But in the beginning, it began with her parents. So could you talk to us a little bit about Eleanor's parents? How did her mother and father view her and treat her?
Sure. Her mother and father were quite the characters. Her mother was a beautiful New York socialite, very connected in the world of fancy folks in New York City. And when Eleanor Roosevelt was born, her mother felt that she was very plain looking, and not very pretty. And that's kind of a nice way of putting it. And so, in the eyes of her mother.
Yeah.
And so she was something of a disappointment. She expected to have this beautiful daughter that would, just take the New York social scene. And that's not the way Eleanor, physically appeared, at least to her mother. And so, and then of course, Eleanor was very shy and very timid. And was she born that way, or did she become that way because of the way her parents treated her? Psychology can work that out. But the point was that she was very shy, very timid, very introspective, and her mother took to calling her Granny. So, here she is, this little girl, and, you would expect the little girl to be called Princess or Muffin or Pumpkin or something like that. And her mother's calling her Granny because she reminds her of a little old lady. Now, you don't have to be a psychiatrist to figure out that this is going to have an impact on somebody's, self-image and such. And so that's kind of the treatment she was getting from her mother. Her father, who she absolutely adored, was a neglective alcoholic. And what I mean by that is that he never abused her or was violent or anything like that with her, but he was very neglective. So the minute he got drinking, he forgot everything else, and then was into the booze. So he would promise Eleanor things, and then he would get drunk and then forget to do them and forget them. And one of the most you know, uh, I think poignant stories is that, he promised her one day a big day in the city. Okay, Eleanor, you and me, it's going to be daddy-daughter day. We're going to New York. We're going to go right into the city. We're going to do whatever you want to do. Central Park, the museum, whatever you want to do. And the first stop he made was at a bar. And so he goes in and he says, listen, I have to go to a meeting. You sit right here, sweetheart. I'll be right back. And he sits her down in the lobby and he goes into the bar and he gets drunk. So drunk, in fact, that they send him home out the back door, so that's, not to be stumbling out into the street. And about an hour and a half goes by, and Eleanor's waiting for her father very patiently. And she tugs on the doorman's jacket and says, when's my dad going to be done with this meeting? And he goes in and he finds out what happened. And he says, oh, little girl, he left. And so there she was, left on the doorstep of this bar, basically in New York, with the promise of a big daddy-daughter day, and totally stolen away from her. So and this was a sort of a reoccurring theme with her father. So they were really not especially good role models in terms of developing her self-esteem and such.
Yeah, and in your talk, you had a picture of the very young Eleanor Roosevelt, and she's a perfectly lovely looking young girl, pretty, and yet this message from, I assume, a competitive mother, was coming through very strong, and then really the abandonment, neglect from her father, not an easy start to life. And then I know that, there was another chapter with, extended family that she went to live with, which was also very challenging in its own ways. Could you tell us about those years and how they compared with living with her parents?
Sure. By the time Eleanor was about 10 years old, she was an orphan. Her mother died of diphtheria, and her father died of complications from alcoholism. So she was sort of passed off from Roosevelt family member to Roosevelt family member. Nobody really quite sure, knowing what to do with her. And so she would go and she would spend a couple of weeks or maybe a couple of months at one place, and then, go through the trauma of, getting new rules, meeting, the family and such. I mean, she knew them from the extended thing, but, living with them is a different story. And then just as she might get settled, she'd be lifted up and moved off to the next, family member. So she was bounced around quite a bit like that. Which again leads to this very unsettled, childhood. And if you're very timid and shy to begin with, this is really churning that up. So she ends up finally living with her grandma Hall in a place called Tivoli, New York, which is just in the northern section of Dutchess County. And her grandma was a very strict disciplinarian. They were, her and her husband had been very into, religion and, very almost Puritan in a way. And so when Eleanor went to live there, by this time her grandfather had passed away, and her grandmother, was running the house very, very, very tightly. And so things would happen where, like, if Eleanor was asked to set the table and maybe put the fork on the wrong side, her grandmother would be very angry at her and would maybe give her the cold shoulder for 2 or 3 days at a time. You need to learn how to do this the right way, that sort of a thing. So rather than nurture her and say, well, listen, honey, the fork goes over here, and that's how we do it. She was very strict and stern with her. She also in this house had 2 uncles who lived there, and they also were alcoholics. And what they would do is they would get drunk in the afternoon. They'd go up to the attic, open the windows, and then they would shoot rifles at people as they went by the property, or they would shoot rifles at Eleanor. So if Eleanor was, yeah, right. I mean, this is like,
what?
you
Shocking.
can't make this stuff
up. You can't make it up. Yeah.
So if she was at the potting barn, let's say, and potting plants and such, when she turned to get the next one, they would shoot the one that she had just done, just to see her, jump. If she was petting her pony, they might shoot into the bale of hay that the pony was eating from, just to see her jump. So this was not a happy or fun place to be growing up. So what they did then was, as the uncles became more and more unpredictable, Grandma Hall packed her up and moved her over to Allenwood School in England. And there she met Madame Silvestri, and things began to turn around there.
Yeah, that was a transformative experience for her, and probably a redemptive one as well, probably saved her. Could you tell us more about what changed for her, how her life got better and why at Allenwood?
Sure. I like to think of the experience at Allenwood School as kind of, the safety net that caught Eleanor Roosevelt. And Madame Silvestri was the headmistress of Allenwood School, and she was a very worldly woman. She had done a lot of traveling. She knew, different languages. She really, ran the school in a very progressive sort of a way. And I would say Madame Silvestri was the first person to see in Eleanor Roosevelt what the rest of the world would see later on. And she encouraged Eleanor Roosevelt in her development. She said, listen, you should travel as much as you can. You should talk with the other girls, argue with them, tell them what you think, take positions on things, and then tell them why they're wrong and you're right, and argue. And this way you'll develop the confidence, you'll develop the ability to look at points from different views and things. And she really encouraged Eleanor to kind of come out of her shell. And she was there for almost 3 years, and she said that they were the 3 happiest years of her life, because for the first time someone took an interest in who she was, what she had to offer, and began to really develop that. So, it really was a turning point and a transformative moment. And we have Madame Silvestri to thank for the modern Eleanor Roosevelt that we all know and love.
And thank you, Madame Silvestri, because, you can't help but wonder what on earth would have happened to her without those 3 years. We probably would never have heard of her. But those 3 years, I mean, how transformative to finally have somebody who sees who you really are and who supports and cares about you and encourage you to develop to become the best person that you can. So
she really was like a life coach, more than
that's right. That's right. Well, um, her life took some other turns after she came back from boarding school, including a fateful meeting as a with FDR. And could you talk some, Jeffrey, about how FDR and Eleanor were different, and yet how, in spite of that, you understand the tug that drew them together?
When Eleanor was, when she left Allenwood School, she came back to New York. She took a job at a tenement house in New York, and she began to, make some of the circles, as a shy, timid young woman in New York City. And what she did was actually a re-meeting of Franklin Roosevelt. She had first met Franklin Roosevelt when she was 2 years old. Of course, they were distant cousins, separated, they were fifth cousins once removed. And the Roosevelt clan, was very, very close. So they were constantly, sort of meeting and re-meeting at these family reunions over the years. The first time they met, Franklin's mother and father had invited Eleanor's mother and father for a visit, and Franklin was 4 and Eleanor was 2. Well, we fast forward, and now Eleanor's 19, Franklin's 21, and they meet in a there's a gathering in a box at Madison Square Garden for a horse show, and FDR's older brother, Rosie Roosevelt, who was 27 years older, had a box in Madison Square Garden, and he would invite various members of the family to use the box. Well, one night Franklin and Eleanor happened to be there in the box together, and the moonbeams began to go back and forth. He fell instantly in love with her. She fell instantly in love with him. And it really was the kind of love that you would want in a young couple. We tend to forget this because, of course, later on there's the affair, and then they kind of become political partners. But the early years of their relationship was really quite lovely and quite beautiful. And they were quite different. So it was really a story of opposites attracting. Eleanor was still quite shy, still quite timid, starting to come out of herself a bit. She was bookish, she was deferential, and she was very introspective still. Franklin was very superficial. He was very outgoing. He only read the parts of books that he thought, were interesting. He was almost borderline arrogant, really. And so these two became kind of the two halves to a perfect whole, where, he would sort of lift her up and bring her out and, stop, getting her to stop taking herself so seriously. And she would sort of bring him down and make him, contemplative and a little more thoughtful in what it was that he was doing. So they really kind of became the two halves of this perfect whole. And he gave her a nickname, and he called her My Angel. So that'll give you a sense of what he felt about her. And so that was where the magic really, really began. And I try never ever to lose sight of the fact that that's really what their relationship was. And I think that it continued that way to some degree throughout the rest of their lives. I don't buy this whole just became a political partnership after that. It was never quite the same after the affair, but it was never fully destroyed either.
Yeah. Well, it certainly was a very romantic beginning, Moonbeams and Stardust, and it's a lovely story, and one that I think sometimes is lost in the later commentary. But I'm curious, to find out more. Franklin's mother, Sarah, played a dominant role in his life, and she loomed also over their budding relationship, and had an impact on whether they would get married and how they would get married, and how and where they lived afterwards. So I hope that you could tell us a little bit about Sarah's impact on their marriage.
Sure. Well, when they fell in love, Franklin and Eleanor, Franklin told his mother, "Hey, I'm in love with Eleanor Roosevelt. I'm going to ask her to marry me." And Sarah said, "Whoa, let's just talk about this for a minute. Eleanor's a lovely girl. No problems with Eleanor as a person. She had known Eleanor Roosevelt for her whole life. She first met Eleanor when she was 2 years old. So she had no real problem with Eleanor as a person. The real problem came from that she didn't want any competition for Franklin's attention. Franklin was Sarah's whole world. By this point, her husband James had passed away, and all she had in the world was Franklin. So she saw Eleanor as kind of a distraction, and as competition really for Franklin's love and affection. So she said, "Listen, that's great. You guys, you're going to get married. That's wonderful. But let's not tell anybody for about a year, okay?" And she actually took Franklin on a trip to the Caribbean for 6 weeks, hoping that he would, sort of lose interest and forget Eleanor and such. And so, here again is a bit of a betrayal for Eleanor, right? She's met this young man. He's handsome. He's rich. He's connected. He's got a great political career going. He lifts her up. And she wants to shout from the rooftops, "Hey, I'm in love. Somebody really loves me. We're gonna get married." And she's told to sit on it for a year.
Yeah.
Dutifully, she does. A year goes by, and they end up getting married on March 17th, 1905, in New York City. And they get married in New York City on March 17th, 1905, out of the pure coincidence and convenience, really, of her Uncle Teddy. Uncle Teddy was president of the United States, and she needed somebody to walk her down the aisle because her father had passed. So she asked Uncle Teddy, who was her favorite uncle, and he in fact said that she was his favorite niece. And he said, "Well, listen, I'm going to be in New York for the St. Patrick's Day parade, right? And as a good politician will be, and I'll swing over. I'll walk you down the aisle. I'll get back to the parade, and everything will be fine." And inadvertently, what he did was he stole all the attention away from Eleanor.
Yeah.
Being Teddy Roosevelt
Yeah.
at this wedding, and she learned a very interesting lesson from that. But she later said it was kind of a big mistake to have him walk her down the aisle, because at her wedding day, when she should have been the center of attention, everybody was paying attention to Uncle Teddy and not to Franklin and Eleanor.
Yeah. So yet another little disappointment and unintentional betrayal, but still a big disappointment, not what she, I'm sure, was hoping for or counting on. So
certainly not. No.
Well, so FDR went on to enter politics then as a young man, first in Albany in state government, and then in Washington, D.C. So that was a different life. He had a growing engagement in politics and traveled a lot, multiple social engagements all the time. And so tell us a little bit about what impact this entry into politics had on their relationship, again, given their different contrasting personalities and how these types of experience would land on both of them.
Sure. Well, at first, it played to Eleanor's advantage because when Franklin went to Albany to the state Senate, that put some distance between him and his mother. And so Eleanor kind of got out from under the mother a little bit in that way. Also, Franklin constantly had people over to the house, political, cronies and such. And so what this did was it gave Eleanor an insight at ground level as to what was going on in the state. And of course, Franklin had, eyes on national politics as well. So this played out very well for her because it gave her insight into all that and sort of a firsthand interaction with that. But then Franklin put Woodrow Wilson's name in nomination for the presidency, and Woodrow Wilson was a big hero to FDR. And when Woodrow Wilson won the presidency, he appointed Franklin Roosevelt to be the Assistant Secretary of the Navy. So they left Albany and they went down to Washington. And again, this at first played pretty well for Eleanor because again, distance from Sarah, and then also this idea of now she's got access to Washington. But soon Sarah decided, well, you need help with the kids. I'll move down and I'll spend a lot of time with you and I'll help you raise the kids. And then the other thing was that although Eleanor was able to get out as sort of a wife of a high-ranking government official, that in some ways paved the way for her. Part of the job of being Assistant Secretary of the Navy was that Franklin had to attend a lot of cocktail parties, a lot of social events, and those sorts of things. And Eleanor didn't like to do that. There's always alcohol at these things, and alcoholism ran in her family. She had a very unhappy feeling about alcohol, and she was still very shy and timid. Although she was coming out of her shell and she was making a lot of progress, she wasn't quite fully there yet. So she didn't like going to these cocktail parties and such. In addition to that, Franklin loved the Navy, and so he spent every chance he could get going around the country or going around the world, and inspecting naval bases and such. And of course, Eleanor would stay home with the children most of the time. So he was away a lot, and when he was there, he was dragging her off to these cocktail parties. And so finally, she'd had enough. She said, "Listen, I can't do this anymore. You got to go. You got to go alone." And he said, "Well, I can't go alone. That's just not the way it's done." And so she said, "Well, then you'll have to take somebody else." And he said, "How can I take her? Who am I going to take?" And so she recommended that he take her social secretary, Lucy Mercer.
A fateful choice.
And how? And how?
Yeah.
And so Lucy Mercer was beautiful. She was fun at a party. She, could take her alcohol. She knew when to laugh at the jokes and those sorts of things. And she was very at ease in this world and in this circle. And Franklin ends up, we don't know when it began, but he ends up having an affair with her.
Yeah.
We do know when it ended, though, and it ended quite abruptly when Franklin had returned from Europe after the First World War, and he had a touch of pneumonia. And so he said, "I don't feel well. I'm going to go upstairs and lay down." And he did. And Eleanor was helping to unpack his stuff, and she found a satchel of love letters that he, back and forth with this Lucy Mercer. And she said she felt like the world had, the bottom of her world had just dropped out. So that's when we know, the affair was over, but we don't really know when it began. But it went on for some time.
It's such an amazing story, both the fateful choice to say, well, why don't you take Lucy Mercer? And then the way that she found out about it by finding the love letters in his luggage when he was recovering. So, in your talk earlier, Jeffrey, you mentioned that they did discuss divorce after the affair came out. But of course, as we all know, they never got divorced. So what do we know about that discussion and what made them decide to stay together?
Well, again, I think there's two things we can learn from this. One is we get an insight into Eleanor Roosevelt's character once again. And she says, "Listen, you know what? If you love this woman as much as these letters seem to indicate, you need to be with her, not with me." So she's thinking of Franklin, really, in this thing. So that's the first thing. And then the second thing was, he says, "No, let's work this out. Let's work this out." And the reason that they wanted to work this out was because, two reasons. Number one is Louis Howe, who was FDR's political advisor, and also a friend to Eleanor, who he also helped bring Eleanor out of her shell a little bit. He said, "Listen, Franklin, you want a political career? You're not going to have a political career if you're divorced. You can't run a marriage. How are you going to run a state or a country or anything else for that matter? So you cannot get divorced if you want to have a political career." But more importantly, his mother came and said, "Listen, Franklin, there'll be no divorce in this family. You found her, you fell in love, you married her, you cheated on her, you make it right. And if you divorce Eleanor, I will cut you off from the Roosevelt family fortune." And Sarah maintained control of the Roosevelt family fortune until she died in 1941. Now, think, right? Franklin only lived until 1945, so he only had control of the family fortune for 4 years. So it was at that point that the lovey-dovey, part of it faded away, and it really became more of that political partnership that everybody, talks about. But I again maintain that it was still based upon a mutual love, a mutual respect, a mutual admiration, and this belief in each other that really was quite special and quite unique. But the way things unfolded, it just wasn't ever able to be the same way again.
Yeah. In these times, it's easy to forget how controversial divorce was. And it would indeed, I'm sure Louis Howe was right, it would have ended his political career.
Absolutely.
But more to the point, Sarah didn't want him to get divorced, and she held the purse strings and sway over his life, until 1941. So there were multiple factors involved in that decision. Also a fateful decision, though, it strikes me, to stay together because of the incredibly productive political partnership that grew up between them. So, I'm curious about, from your view, Jeffrey, what made their political partnership so powerful and effectual?
Well, I think it was the fact that there was a lot of communication between the two of them, and they both believed in the same things. They were both uh, very progressive. They were both very concerned about what was going on in other people's lives. Mrs. Roosevelt, because she felt pain, she felt disappointment, she felt being on the outside her whole life, so she understood that when other people felt that. With Franklin, it wasn't. I don't want to say it wasn't as genuine, but he was raised to believe that, you needed to take, care of other people. To those that much is given, much is expected. That became really true for him when he contracted polio and suddenly, wasn't able to walk. And so now it's like, wow, by no fault of your own, things can happen that you have no control over, and you need outside help to get over these things. So they both believed in that. And then there was this communication back and forth, and he really used her as a sounding board. He would say, he would come up with an idea, and then he'd mention it to her, like, and sort of float it as a floater. What do you think of this? Or maybe he wouldn't say, what do you think of this, but he would mention the idea, knowing that she would give him her opinion on that. And she never ever said, don't do this or do that. She always floated it back to him in the idea of a suggestion or a piece of advice. She'd look down and say, Franklin, surely you're not thinking of doing, that sort of thing. And he'd be, oh, no, I had never, that didn't cross my mind. And so that's how they communicated back and forth with each other. And he depended on her to get honest, positive feedback, both from her, but also through her. And one of the ways he did this was he sort of trained her. He said, listen, when you go traveling around, and she traveled 44,000 miles as her first year as First Lady.
Wow.
It was difficult for him to travel because of the burdens of the presidency and also the burdens of the polio.
Yeah.
So she became his traveling ambassador in many ways. And he said, listen, when you go to Philadelphia, they're going to show you the best, fanciest, most spiffed up places because you're the First Lady. That's not really what Philadelphia looks like. So when you travel, and she generally traveled by train, ask the conductor to tell you 20 minutes before you're going to meet the destination. And then time 20 minutes out when you leave. And at those 20-minute points, I want you to take a look out the window. What do you see? What are the houses like? What toys are the children playing with? What are the conditions of the clothes on the clotheslines? How many of the shops are actually open? That's what I want you to get a sense of, because that will tell you fully and realistically what it's like in and around Philadelphia, not the fancy spiffed up places. And so she did this, and it even got down to the point where he said, if you go to a soup kitchen and they tell you that they're serving, chicken gumbo, you stick your nose in that pot and make sure it's really chicken gumbo and not, cabbage stew. And so he was able to get some real insight as to what was going on in the country from Mrs. Roosevelt. And she did not candy coat anything for him. She let him have it. And it was because of that, he was really able to get a sense of how these things were working.
That's fascinating. And he could then also communicate it to the people who were struggling, and in a way that was well-informed and authentic. So that's a powerful partnership. Absolutely. I've never heard it explained quite that way before, Jeff. Thank you so much for that. It's really interesting. Well, I was hoping that you could share the amazing Marion Anderson story with us, because I had heard the story in outline form before about Constitution Hall and the DAR, but I wasn't conversant with the particular role that Eleanor Roosevelt played in that. And it's such a telling story about civil rights. And so would you please share that story with us, particularly Eleanor's role?
Sure, absolutely. It's actually one of my favorite Eleanor Roosevelt stories. So a minute ago, I had mentioned that, on March 17th, 1905, they were married in New York, and Uncle Teddy kind of, he didn't crash the wedding. He was invited, but he sort of stole all the attention.
Took it over.
Exactly. And Mrs. Roosevelt learned a very valuable lesson from that. And this is one of my favorite Eleanor Roosevelt stories because it shows you the kind of person that she was. She learned these lessons in life. She held these lessons in life, and then she looked for ways to apply them. Well, we fast forward to the Marion Anderson story, and it's February 1939, and Eleanor Roosevelt gets wind that there's going to be a concert at Constitution Hall. And a friend of hers, Marion Anderson, is going to be on the slate to sing there. Well, she's not allowed to sing there because she's an African American.
Yeah.
And Constitution Hall was a segregated hall, basically. So, you couldn't have an African American sing there. And Mrs. Roosevelt further found out that it was the concert was being sponsored by the Daughters of the American Revolution, DAR, which she happened to be a member of. So when Mrs. Roosevelt found out that her friend Marion Anderson wasn't going to be able to sing there, and I say friend because they were friends, but I think she would have done this even if it wasn't, even if they hadn't been friends, she would have, I think, struck the blow for civil rights. What Mrs. Roosevelt did was she resigned her membership in protest in the DAR because they wouldn't let Marion Anderson sing there. Well, the concert goes on, and nobody really knows, history, doesn't know about it, right? But what happens is 6 weeks later on Easter Sunday, a concert has been arranged on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial, and Eleanor Roosevelt had a hand in that, and 75,000 people turn out for that concert.
Yeah.
Now, there's one very important person who is invited but doesn't attend the concert, and that is none other than Mrs. Roosevelt. Mrs. Roosevelt knows that if she goes to this concert, everybody will be talking about Eleanor Roosevelt attends, concert for African American women, right? She wants Marion Anderson to have her moment in the sun. She does not want to do to Marion Anderson what Uncle Teddy had done to her. Inadvertently, but nonetheless, the pain was there. So she does not go to that concert, and Marion Anderson has her moment in the sun. And, unlike the concert at Constitution Hall that nobody's ever heard about, most people are at least familiar with the, again, the outline of the story of that. And that is the example that I like to use, but there are dozens and dozens and dozens of examples like that Mrs. Roosevelt learns a lesson, holds that lesson, and then applies it later on.
Yeah, it's a wonderful story, and her choosing not to go because, remember Uncle Teddy, it's a grace note to that story, and clearly there were many grace notes in her life.
And think about the timeline on that, right? We're talking March 17th, 1905 to Easter 1939. That's a long time to hold that lesson and then wait, for an opportunity to apply it.
Absolutely, yeah. Well, there was one more significant betrayal in her life, and that's what happened when an exhausted Franklin returned from Yalta and went to, I think it was Warm Springs. Anyway, could you tell us about the resurgence of Lucy Mercer in FDR's life?
Sure. President Roosevelt had a place in Warm Springs, Georgia, that it was an old resort, and he bought it and turned it into a convalescent hospital for people with polio. And he would often return there over the course of his life. He bought it, I think, in the late 20s. And, the rest of his life, he would return there as often as he could because he was able to get rest there, and he was able to sort of regenerate and rejuvenate. So he goes to Yalta. It's like a 40,000-mile trip. He's talking with Stalin and Churchill, the big three, and they're talking about the end of the war and the post-war period, what it's going to look like when we win this war. Because Roosevelt really believed that it was not just important to win the war, but we had to win the peace. And that was one of the problems with the First World War was we won the war, but we didn't win the peace. And we left all these smoldering ashes that then blew into World War II. So he wanted to prevent that from happening. So he goes to Yalta, and he gets Stalin basically to sign on to this idea of, the United Nations, but he's exhausted. So he comes back, he gives a speech in front of the Congress. It's the very first time he gives a speech in Congress sitting down. And he apologizes for the posture, but he says, I just returned from Yalta. I've got these leg braces. I'm exhausted, but here's my report. So he gives the report, and off he goes down to Warm Springs, Georgia. Mrs. Roosevelt stays in Washington. She's got duties and things that she's attending to. And while the president is in Warm Springs, Georgia, one afternoon, April 12th, 1945, he's sitting for a portrait, and a woman by the name of Madame Shumatov is sketching and painting his portrait. And he raises his hand to his head, and he says, I have a terrific headache. And he goes unconscious. They pick him up, they carry him into the next room, and 3 hours later, he dies. So they informed Mrs. Roosevelt, hey, the president has fainted. She says, okay, well, I know he's exhausted. He's down there to rejuvenate. Keep me posted as to what's going on. They call a few hours later, and, the president has passed. So she rushes down to Warm Springs, Georgia, and she gets there and she says, well, what was going on? Tell me everything that was, just like you would, like, like what happened? What was going on? And so it's let loose that, well, he was sitting over there, for a portrait, Madame Shumatov was sketching and painting it. He was sitting next to Lucy Mercer, and he raised his head. Oh, Lucy Mercer. Lucy Mercer, the other woman that he'd had the affair with. And again, Eleanor's heart, broken once again. And so here was Franklin, who had promised that he would never see Lucy Mercer again. That was the deal, to sort of stay in the marriage. And he did keep that promise for quite a number of years, but he began to have a correspondence again with her. He began to have these meetups again with her, and she was there with him when he had the stroke in Warm Springs, Georgia. So, that's a terrible thing in and of itself. And then to have Eleanor sort of stumble across it, that way was also equally terrible, but it gets even worse. So she says, how did this happen? How did these two reestablish connection? And come to find out, it was her very own and only daughter, Anna, who had acted as the catalyst that had kind of gotten them back together. And Mrs. Roosevelt, and talk about another betrayal, right?
Yeah, a layered betrayal.
Absolutely.
Thick and deep.
Yeah, exactly, right? And again, you can't make this stuff up,
no,
right?
You can't
make this stuff up. And so she said, how could you do that to me? How could you do that? You know the history with this woman. And Anna looked her in the eyes and she said, Mama, you have to understand, when you're president, everybody that comes through that door wants something. They want a congressional appointment. They want a dam in their district. They want something in the budget. They want you to make a personal appearance at a campaign rally. Papa needed to be with people who just wanted to be with him because of who he was, Franklin Roosevelt. Not President Roosevelt, but Franklin Roosevelt. And Lucy Mercer, who had been around since back in the day, understood Franklin at that level. And Eleanor said to her, she thought about it for a moment. She said, you're right. That was a good thing you did for Papa. By allowing him to be around people like that, it was helpful to him. And she forgave her. She forgave her. Now that was, that's as
extraordinary.
Beyond,
it's just extraordinary. Another beyond a grace note, but just speaks a lot about her character. And her capacity for love and empathy and forgiveness, which are just remarkable.
It also speaks to how she felt about Franklin, that hey, this was good for him, so it's a good thing.
Right, that's right. It's just an amazing story. Well, there were the years after Franklin then, and I was hoping you could talk about some of the things that Eleanor went on to devote herself to. And this is the Eleanor that we baby boomers remember. It's really the post-Franklin era of her life. So what were the causes that she devoted herself to, and why, Jeff?
Well, let me just back up a little bit first. And when Franklin dies, they bring his body back. He's buried in Hyde Park. And Mrs. Roosevelt says, famously, the story is over. And it was for about 20 minutes. And then she picked herself up and off she went again. And, President Truman said, stay in the White House as long as you like, and she stayed for a bit and settled things up. And then she, came back up to Hyde Park. She settled in her home, Valkill. And then she began to be involving herself in a number of activities. She became an advocate for women's rights. She became an advocate for civil rights, early supporter of Martin Luther King. She became a real kingmaker in the Democratic Party. One of the first things that Harry Truman does to wrap himself more in the Roosevelt mantle, because remember, he was only vice president for 83 days, is the following, 2 weeks after President Roosevelt died, there was supposed to be a conference in San Francisco, the opening conference, the first conference really of the United Nations. And Franklin had planned to go and was going to give a speech and, lay out the whole framework and such. And so one of the first decisions that Truman makes is to go ahead with this conference. And then he appoints Mrs. Roosevelt to be a committee member to the American delegation. Because he knows that she believes everything that he believed in terms of, having to win this peace and such. But he also knows it's good politics. Everybody loves Mrs. Roosevelt. I'll wrap myself in the Roosevelt mantle that way. And so she becomes a big advocate for civil rights and human rights, there at the United Nations. She also goes on to, to lend support to the Cancer Society. She, promotes hearing aids at one point, and she would periodically do these endorsements, but she always had in the contract that she could talk about whatever she wanted to talk about. And there's this famous, funny story about how one time she was hawking margarine. She was hawking margarine, and so there's this commercial, and she's got this piece of bread, and she's got the spoonful of margarine, and she says in that Eleanor Roosevelt voice, "Look how the margarine spreads across the bread so smoothly and evenly, just like atomic weapons are spreading around this world, and we need to." So I don't think she sold much margarine that day, but she spoke her mind. She used every opportunity, and I think that's what was really so amazing about Mrs. Roosevelt was that she was a media master. She wrote her My Day column every day for 36 years, something like that, over 3,000 columns. She was on the radio. Even though she had that high kind of pitched voice, she made public appearances, even though she never quite felt that she was attractive. She wrote over 24 books, even though she only really had the equivalent of a high school, graduation. But she had ideas, and she had thoughts, and she had a mission to help people who were not in a position to help themselves. And that became her lifeblood after the president had passed away.
Yeah. And for the reasons you just explained, made her such an admired woman in American history. And you've sort of been answering this question throughout the whole conversation we've been having, Jeff, but I want to just see I want to pose it to you to see what else it might draw from you. So FDR and Eleanor are legendary figures in American history. I mean, FDR, World War II, okay, we can understand that, and saving the country from the Great Depression, but Eleanor she's been dead since 1962. But she too remains an absolutely legendary figure, and the two of them even just amp it up. So books about Eleanor and Franklin, they will will become a bestseller more than likely, because we're all endlessly fascinated with them. So I'm curious you've been describing their legacy, but how do you understand their larger than life aura, and how the legend lives on, and if anything, only expands and deepens, often in contrast to contemporary political figures?
Well, I think one of the things that speaks to that is the fact that they were not only legendary people in American history, but in world history.
Yes.
You go anywhere in the world and you mention Eleanor Roosevelt, they know who you're talking about.
Yeah.
Not so much any other first lady, or maybe a little bit more now that we've got this mass media and that sort of thing. But I think it goes back to the fact that we are living in the world that the Roosevelts created. Now, we don't always realize that, right? But if Roosevelt had not led us to victory, the world to victory in World War II, and Hitler had taken over, and if you go back and you look at 1942 and where the Nazis were and how well they were doing, it's, they came pretty darn close to take it over the world. Roosevelt stopped that, he prevented that, and he made the world safe for freedom. If you look at the economy that we live in, things like Social Security seems like it's always been around. Well, it's only been around since 1935.
Right.
Franklin Roosevelt created that. You look at the 40-hour week, the Wagner Act, Franklin Roosevelt created that. So I think so much of the reason that they are still so important to us in the world is because they are so much in the world. And one of the things that I really love about working with the papers at the Roosevelt Library is that you can't go more than, a document or two without seeing some reference to our children, our children's children, future generations, those who come after us. So the Roosevelts were talking about us, I mean, I get goosebumps when I think about that. They were talking about us. We live in the world that they created. And so to me, that makes them very real. And just as a weird sort of thing, I keep on my desk 3 links of chain. And
Yeah.
I do this to remind myself of who I am and who we are as a generation. There were those that came before us. There are those that will come after us.
Yeah.
This is us. We are that link. And so when the Roosevelts were talking about that future, they were talking about us and they were talking about the people who came after us. And I
Yeah.
think that's why they are still so important
Yeah.
and so real. They're touching our lives every day. I guarantee you, your folks are driving by some project that was worked on by the CCC, the
Yeah.
WPA,
Yeah.
one of those new 40, there was 40 New Deal
Yeah.
programs. The fact that you feel comfortable keeping your money in a bank,
Yeah.
FDIC, the fact that we're using these airwaves, right? FCC, the Federal Communication Commission, is regulating these sorts of things. So there's Roosevelt fingerprints on every single thing that
Yeah.
we do. And if you look closely at those Roosevelt fingerprints, you're going to see many of them, most of them are probably Franklin's, but many of them are Eleanor's as well.
Absolutely. It's that visionary optimism that you were describing at the beginning of our interview, Jeff, that we have absolutely benefited from, still do in so many ways. And I think it's a useful thing to remember that visionary optimism is a powerful force in the world. And to begin dealing with some of the challenges of our times by remembering that visionary optimism, if you keep at it, if you never let go, you never stop, you can change the world, because the
Right.
Roosevelts certainly did.
Right.
So thank you. That was
Let me give you,
wonderful. Go
oh,
ahead.
you're welcome. Let me give you one of my favorite Eleanor Roosevelt. Well,
Okay.
actually, I have two favorite Eleanor Roosevelt quotes. One of them is, "You don't have to become a hero overnight." And I love that quote, and I tell that to all the students I work with because it gives you permission to fail. You're going to get up today, you're going to try something, you're going to do something. Hopefully it will work. Maybe it won't. If it doesn't, you don't give up, right? You brush yourself off. You say, okay, what went wrong? I did this when I should have done that. Let me try that tomorrow. I'm going to try that. And it gives you permission to be wrong, to make mistakes, to screw up. You don't have to become a hero overnight. And Mrs. Roosevelt lived that throughout her entire 78 years. The other quote that she had, which I love, is, and I'm going to paraphrase this a little bit, but she said, "Human rights begin in small places, so small, in fact, that they can't be seen on a map." And what she means by that is they begin where you are. If Mary there and Jeff here and all the folks that are watching and listening right now, make it their goal today to make the world a better place where they are, to be a little more compassionate, to be a little more understanding, to lend a little hand, then what happens is in all those places, the world becomes a better place. And, it's this optimism and this ability to see where you want to be and then work to build the bridges there. One of the tricks that Mrs. Roosevelt would use when she was trying to trap somebody into helping her is she would boil down, and I say trap in the best sense of the word, is she would boil down the discussion to a yes or no. And she'd say, well, like, let's say, what are we going to do about, feeding children? Well, it's expensive, right? How are we going to get the food? How are we going to grow the food? How are we going to distribute the food? Who's going to do it? Da 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 da. So all these questions you can throw up as roadblocks to this. But Mrs. Roosevelt would boil it down to a question. Don't you think we should be feeding our children? Shouldn't our children have the food that they need? And who's going to say no to that, right?
Right.
So the minute you say yes, she takes you as a partner. Good. I'm glad we agree. Now we have to work out how to do it. And what that does is you basically agreed to the premise.
Right.
Now you have to work with her to work out the difficulties in doing that. So many people jump right to the difficulties and let it stop at that. Mrs. Roosevelt brought it down to the yes or the no. Once she had you at yes, then you were a partner and she was going to hold your feet to the fire to do what had to be done to get it done.
Just brilliant.
Really
Just a brilliant, because when people say yes, then if they work with you, they're working for something they themselves say they believe in. They're not working against you. They're not even compromising. So, Jeff, I can't thank you enough. Oh, go ahead.
You can bring them back to that by saying, well, remember you agreed that we needed to do this.
That's right.
So absolutely.
Just brilliant. Jeff, thank you. You just make Eleanor Roosevelt come alive in the best way. And that means it strikes me that it's very consistent with who she was, that you do this. She would love what you do because you make her spirit tangible So thank you so much. I just have loved listening to you
Uh,
and learning about Eleanor Roosevelt. I really appreciate it. Thank you so much, Jeff.
oh, it's been my pleasure. The hour flew by, and
It did.
I want to thank your viewers and your listeners for taking the time out to learn a little bit about Mrs. Roosevelt. You can learn a lot more by visiting our website. Just Google Roosevelt Presidential Library. There's lots of information there. There's thousands of books that have been written about the Roosevelts.
Yeah.
We've only scratched the surface here. They are a couple that is worthy of further investigation because you can learn so much, be inspired so much, and when you wake up in the morning and you feel like you're having a bad day, think about what Eleanor Roosevelt and Franklin Roosevelt went through, and you'll be ashamed of yourself, and you'll begin to make the world a better place right where you are.
Thank you, Jeff. Thank you
you,
so
Mary. It's
much. I
been
really
wonderful to be with
appreciate it.
you.
It's been just wonderful. I really appreciate it. Well,
Thanks.
that's it for today, everybody. I hope you'll join us next week on Thursday at 9 on Channel 9 for the morning show. If you missed any part of today's show, it'll be available for viewing on Port Media's YouTube channel playlist for the morning show. Just go to ncmhub.org, click on the YouTube icon, then click on playlist and scroll down. Each show will also air on WJOP FM 96.3 on Friday at 8 a.m. And then again the following Tuesday at 4 p.m. and Wednesday at 3 p.m. It'll also be available as a podcast on the SoundCloud. Just go to ncmhub.org and click on the cloud icon and then scroll down. Also, a fond farewell to our intrepid producer, Tyler Neufeld. This is his last morning show today. He's taking off for New York City, and we wish him well. Many great adventures to you, Tyler, and thank you for all your hard work. You will be much missed. All right, bye, everybody. Take care now. Farewell.